Hey guys, we're going to go through a long summary of some theory, and then we're going to produce another video which then goes through a reading of exactly the same theory. We get our prior knowledge and basic concepts here, and then we get a more consolidated and nuanced understanding while we do the reading, okay? So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to explore Nagel's account of the subjective nature of consciousness. And then we're going to look at his criticism of materialist reductionism to properly account for the nature of consciousness. Now, just note quickly, when he says materialist reductionism, he's talking about philosophies that say that matter and only matter can account for how consciousness works. And he's basically saying it doesn't. So to do this, we need to name and define some key terms, interrelate them, form premises, combine those premises to generate conclusions, and then combine all the conclusions to generate an extended form argument, which ends up being the philosophy and or theory. Okay? We've done that always, and we're going to do that, albeit implicitly, as we go through our concept map today. We also need to outline his account of the subjective nature of consciousness. Then move on to see why he thinks consciousness is an important area for any philosophy that tries to explain mind. And then we need to outline why he believes that current materialist reductionist theories do not properly account for the nature of consciousness. Bradley. So write these down, pretty please with the cherry on top, and then score yourself on each of them. And then go to Google and have a look at what a cooking reduction looks like. Because once you've done that, you'll be able to understand some of the images that I've got up on my concept map. Cheers. Okay, to start off with, we get told that consciousness is defined as an awareness of self. Many animals have it, but it's really difficult, extremely difficult to describe what consciousness is. We can do it using subjective language, but it's not something that we can really describe or account for using the objective scientific language that we usually use in philosophy or science to describe our experiences, okay? Then he moves on to an examples where he tries to study what consciousness is, and he tells us, look, there is evidence to suggest that a microbe is less conscious than a grasshopper, and there is evidence to suggest that a grasshopper is less conscious than a fish. But that's really not the point. We really want to dive into human consciousness because that's what we know. And we want to pretty much say that it's pretty safe to say that we can easily describe what consciousness is. And we could also easily say that higher order mammals like dolphins or chimpanzees also have a large degree of consciousness. And when we actually account for all this evidence and everything like that, that's great, but it doesn't get to the key explanation or key account of consciousness, which is there must always be something that it is like to be that organism. It is something like for that organism, okay? I'll give you some time to take some notes. Now from here we start exploring materialist theories of consciousness. And Nagel argues that consciousness has a very subjective nature. The nature of it is subjective, and it's a very subjective experience, okay? What it is like, when he says what it is like, he's really saying what is the phenomenal experience of consciousness like? And when we talk about this term phenomenal, we're really talking about phenomenology, which is a philosophy which would have started here from Kant when he starts talking about the critique of pure reason. And that's where he starts outlining his theory of phenomenology. But then it's further elaborated by Hegel, and Hegel really, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, tries to outline a metaphysics or an epistemology for how the world works purely by accounting for our human experience in the world. And when we talk about the phenomenology from the point of view of these two, what we're really talking about is the nominal versus the phenomenal world. We have the nominal world that is outside of consciousness, and then we have the phenomenal, which is our mental experience of the world, We see what the phenomenal world is, but we can only understand it through our senses and through the way our mind shapes information through the senses. So it's the veil. Phenomenal reality is the veil which we see the world through and understand the world through. That's why I've got here a picture which outlines phenomenal as the process of perception, because by the time the real world has been filtered through our senses and through our perception, we've organized it and rearranged it in a way that makes sense to us, and that's really the only access of the world that we get, all right? The phenomenal nature of reality. And what he says is that this nature, the way that the phenomenal world is, it can never really be captured by materialist theories. Take a note. So I hope you've taken a note. He says that materialist reductionist theories, that's really important. Not necessarily theories that acknowledge that matter has something to do with the way that the world works or the way that consciousness works, but theories that only reduce or only say that the material world is only needed to understand how consciousness or the mind works, have issues. They can't fully account for or explain the phenomenal nature of consciousness, because the nature of consciousness is subjective, first person. It's phenomenal, okay? So to start with, for instance, materialist logic, the language of logic, is incompatible with the way phenomenal consciousness works. It doesn't work. In fact, materialist accounts for mind are much better at explaining how mind works when they don't actually account for consciousness. If they left consciousness out, they would work better. So if we remove consciousness from the whole argument of what mind is and how mind works, a theory like smarts makes a lot more sense. It's much more compatible with that account of consciousness. Take a note. Secondly, they don't examine. Secondly, he argues that when we analyze consciousness, right, the subjective nature of consciousness can't really be explained by two theories that are very important. The first one is functionalism, which is very compatible with materialism and materialist reductionism. Now, functionalism is basically an argument that mental states are like parts of an overall cognitive system. You have inputs into the system and outputs that come out of the system. But mental states such as thoughts and feelings and desires, they're all parts of this overall system designed to produce something or an output after receiving certain inputs into the system. So mental states have functions just like parts have functions. And it's pretty easy to see there's a very good correspondence between functionalism and materialism. Obviously, you could argue certain parts of the brain or the central nervous system have the function, produce the mental states, and therefore allow the cognitive system to work as an overall system with inputs and outputs. That makes sense. The second one, believe it or not, is not a materialist position. It's called intentionality. And intentionality argues that you have mental events, and mental events are events that reflect, again, things like pain, things like desire, things like thoughts. But when you have a mental event, you have almost a thought which is like a sign. It's not a sign, but it's a thought or a mental event which is about something. And the thing is that mental events have an aboutness to them that the physical things they correspond to don't. And because they have an aboutness, they tend to be separate. They are something that is metaphysically different to the physical world they correspond to. So intentionality as a theory rejects or has been used to refute materialist reductionism, because obviously the qualitative nature of our thoughts is different to the actual physical world that they're supposed to reflect. They have an aboutness. These things simply just are. Take a note. So when we talk about these states, when we talk about functional states or intentional states, Nagel is basically saying that these two theories don't account for them, all right? Now, we were saying before that he's really against the materialist reductionist perspective for accounting for how consciousness works, and that's proven by rejecting functionalism and saying, look, it just can't properly account for the nature of consciousness. But he also goes out of his way to reject a non-materialist reductionist theory, just to point out that he doesn't really want to align himself with a particular side. He doesn't want to align himself with dualism or materialism. He just wants to highlight the fact that consciousness is a really important area for any philosophy in mind. Take a note. And he also wants to note that traditional materialist theories, or most modern theories of mind, have neglected to account for how consciousness works, or what consciousness is, or the quality of consciousness, or what it's like to be conscious. Take a note. So yeah, the account doesn't explain, well, the account neglects consciousness by materialist reductionist theories. And he says we're pretty ignorant of consciousness as a phenomena and how it's experienced and what it is. And he argues that, look, they're unable really to come to, materialist reductionist theories are unable, and modern materialist reductionist theories are unable to come up with firm conclusions, firm philosophical conclusions about what mind is. Okay? Take a note. So let's not forget, okay, that intentionality and materialism, intentionality and functionalism, they don't really account for the nature of subjective, phenomenal, first-person accounts of experience. They don't account for the what is it like, okay? And when they're applied to explaining how robots think, they do it quite adequately. In a sense, they kind of explain our minds like a robot does, but robots don't have the subjective first-person phenomenal experience of consciousness that we do. And that's an issue, all right? And I should probably get rid of intentionality. You know, maybe intentionality, it has issues, but really it's the materialism, the materialist aspects that he's really harping on, okay? Now, we named and defined key terms, we interrelated them, we came up with arguments. We also outlined his account of the subjective nature of human mind. It comes from a first-person account. It's phenomenal. I forgot to tell you that the reason why I have Hegel and I've got Hegel and Kant here, I've told you why they're there, but this guy took Hegel's philosophy, his name's Edmund Husserl, and he turned it into a school of thought, mainly the phenomenology, not the dialectics or the other metaphysics, but just the way he accounted for the phenomenology. And if you forget what that means, just remember, it's not necessarily about what the outside world is, but it's about our representation of the outside world, the subjective nature of that representation, etc. That's what he means when he talks about a phenomenal reality, okay? So we know that it's an important area for philosophy of mind because we have it. There is a particular notion of what it is like to be that organism or what it is for that organism. And it's kind of neglected by materialist reductionist theories. So we should be pretty high up here on our list, all right? Give yourself a score, and the reading is coming up pretty soon. And once we do that, we should get a better, more nuanced account of the things that he's saying, okay? Cheers.